Awesome. So we're live. So hi to everybody that is watching, joining us tonight for our conversation with Rebecca Baum and Carol Ann Haefner. Carol is not with us yet, but she will hopefully be joining us soon. So when she hops in, I'll just bring her in. But for now, we get to talk to Rebecca Baum. So Rebecca, I know that
Hi.
you are a Louisiana native.
Yes,
And so I know you don't live here now. You are currently a freelance writer living in New York, which sounds
correct.
very fancy and fun. Um,
Sometimes, not so much during the pandemic, but
well, yeah, I can imagine that. But yeah, so what I was hoping is that you would tell us a little bit about your book. So your book, Lifelike Creatures.
yes.
I had the opportunity to read this one. It is wonderful. The sense of place here in Louisiana, like you just captured it. I can tell that you like hold so much of where you're from in your heart, and that
Mm.
like poured out in this novel. And I just really enjoyed that. And so what I was hoping is you would kind of tell us a little bit about it and a little bit about like your history and why you wanted to come to this story.
Yeah, thank you so much for reading it. And it's been gratifying that people from Louisiana, my friends, my family, and folks who I don't know have connected with it. It makes me feel like I was successful in presenting it in the way that I felt it internally. And it is my debut novel. And in some ways, I felt like it had to be this story that takes place in the area where I'm from. And it really started off with the landscape. And actually a landscape that's more from central Louisiana, because I am from Avoyelles Parish. And I grew up in part in a cluster of little towns. One of them was Cottonport, Louisiana. So that's the landscape that came to mind. And there was a bayou that ran through the town. So the landscape was the first thing that arose. And then the character of Tara, the 13-year-old, her sensibilities, her personality, and then her mother, this primary relationship that she has with her mother. And then as I started to, flesh out that relationship, then I brought in the larger story, which included the sinkhole. So, and the story itself deals with, Tara and her mother, who is an addict and alcoholic, the fact that they managed to live their lives and make their way, with Tara often being the mother herself. And then there is an industrial disaster on their property, a catastrophic sinkhole that throws everything out of whack. And her mother ends up becoming this sort of accidental hero. And Tara, who, has always held her mother with kid gloves, is she going to fall off the edge today? Or is she, my strong mother who I love, who's funny, who, is comfortable with her feet in the mud too, who's kind of a woman who's not afraid of using a hammer or, saying what comes straight to her mind. She has a certain audacity and charisma. And so when this sinkhole happens, her mother ends up becoming sort of an accidental hero. And Tara starts to believe in her, and unsurprisingly, her mother sort of implodes under the pressure. So that's sort of the setup.
Yeah, absolutely. The dynamic between them and the way that the people we love can sometimes fail us.
Yes.
And having to understand that you can still have the love that you've always had for that person. And even in some ways respect, which I thought it was really interesting, the way that she respects her mother after just, so many failures and without knowing. So one of the things about your novel is perspective, right? The way that you give the point of view of each of these characters and the way that they play off of each other. I just loved it. And I know that you guys haven't read it yet. You're going to have to read it. We have copies in the shop. There's going to be copies at the library. But so one of the things that's great about Lifelike Creatures is that it kind of moves from point of view from Tara, who is the young girl, and her mother, Joan. And you get to see the way that they reflect each other, and the way that they reflect these events that are happening. And I just loved the way that they spoke back and forth to each other.
Second, Michelle. Carol just texted me. Everyone, this is happening live. She is in the waiting room. So you were asking me about, or you were commenting on this sort of limitations of love between family members. And, you know, even though we can love them with all of our hearts, there's still the question of, does that extend to infinity, or are there times when, you know, we have to step back and withdraw our, maybe not our love, but like our caretaking, or in some cases enabling. And I think that definitely comes, you know, that is part of the inquiry of Lifelike Creatures.
That's wonderful. And so what I was thinking about with that was the way that their dual points of view really get that across. Because as we kind of see with Joan, she's a person that completely lacks any kind of healthy boundary. And so ultimately what happens with Tara, like through the events of the novel, as their life just becomes larger than life, right?
Yeah.
She kind of learns that she has to start instituting those with her
The
mother.
hard
And yeah, and I loved how you navigated that through their points of view and their perspectives on what was happening within the plot of the novel. So I was hoping that you could talk a little bit about points of view and writing from a child and a mother's points of view, and how you found the space to give them each, that full perspective.
Yeah, thank you. Well, it definitely started off as Tara's story, and I didn't have any intention of switching into a different POV. But as I got into about a third of the way into the novel, telling it through Tara's story, I was in a workshop. I forgot to mention that. I'd written like maybe a chapter or two, and then I ended up bringing those pages into this awesome workshop taught by Jeff Orvan, which I highly recommend. And, so as I was writing the first chapters and I was cruising along and I was getting their relationship down, and the feedback I started to get was that I was slipping into out of Tara's perspective and into Joan's perspective. So then I go home, and then I would, get back to the computer, and I would try to wrangle the story back into Tara's POV, and maybe I'd be successful that time. But, a chapter or two later, the same thing would happen. I would start slipping into Joan. It was like Joan was pulling me forcibly into her POV. And at one point, Jeff was like, why don't you just go with it? Why don't you just allow it? And it was like this light bulb went on, and it was this completely freeing experience to allow this character that really wanted to be heard to basically, inform me of that fact, and then to start writing from her POV. And her POV is so wild. I mean, she's what might be called feral. There's no filter. Whatever comes to her mind is out of her mouth immediately. And, she is free in some ways. So it was super fun, I have to say, to write from Joan's POV. But then I knew I had to go back into Tara's POV, because she's the one that had her heart from the very beginning. And, we want to know how it resolves for her. And we want to know what her interior life is like after having had, all the trials and tribulations of that middle chunk of the novel. So.
It's so interesting though that you say Joan like forced herself and forced
Really?
her perspective. Like if anyone has any doubt that books are magic, like here it is. Books are magic because like it's just such a perfect like even that idea that you as a writer experience, like it's a perfect representation of her character.
Yeah.
Just the like you said, like just audacious, right? Like she, you know, and to have her just come through you in that way.
Yes. Yes, she was, I mean, and her backstory really was a story of, being imprisoned in a way, in, abusive childhood, abusive marriage until her husband died very early on. So her life is about like just freedom and, taking whatever she can. And so she took me. She took me. So
Well, that's
I'm
awesome.
glad,
So
and I'm glad she did.
I mean, I am too because it makes the two of them it makes the novel like it was just such a brilliant choice on your for you to make. But on that note of point of view, I'm going to bring Carol in because she should be good. And she
Awesome.
has an entirely different experience with point of view and her characters that I am super excited to talk about. So let's see. So, hey, Carol.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
The magic works.
Yay.
With these funny, I think like 10-year-old mics hanging off my ears. But
Oh, like I'm the same. So you're totally fine. But yeah, so everybody, so this is Carol Haefner. So Carol is an author. She's written several, I believe, 3 YA novels, and now she is here with us to talk about Knee Deep. Also an established screenwriter. So you're just all around impressive lady. But me and Rebecca were talking a bit about perspective, and so. I haven't talked much about the plot of Knee Deep, so I was hoping that you could kind of give us just a little bit about what your book is about, and then I want to talk about how you situate us in the perspective of just one character throughout the entirety of your novel and what that choice meant to you.
well, Knee Deep is basically a Katrina love story. It takes place during and then following our 16-year-old protagonist, Camille, through the first season of Mardi Gras after Katrina slammed New Orleans. It's an interracial love story. She is deeply in love with the boy next door who goes missing in the storm. And so she and her mother and his grandmother evacuate during the storm to St. Martinville to stay with Cajun cousins. And so she experiences the storm through the stories of others. And I decided, well, you know what? I didn't decide. Camille decided that I would write this novel using her voice. And in fact, if I can just read this one little thing on the back cover, because this came to me in the middle of the night before I started the novel. And I knew Camille was my protagonist. And I woke up and I wrote this down, and this is what she said. This is a story of what happened to me on Fat Tuesday, how I ended up on the steps of St. Mary's, the hem of my pirate's petticoat soaked in somebody else's blood. Although I know the story to be true, I don't totally believe it myself. Like all good tales born out of the bayou, mine involves the dead, the living, and the one trapped in the brackish waters between heaven and hell. It is a story of true love and true disaster, and at the end of it, I'll leave it up to you to decide which is the harder to survive. Now, I had no idea what she was doing on the steps of St. Mary's or why there was blood involved. And so, but I just loved that passage, and I thought, I've got to figure this out. And very shortly, she just took over. I intended to write it in third person, sort of third person close, really, the way Rebecca did. I love that, where you're sort of like almost in that memoir position, but not quite. You have a little bit of distance. But she took over. So I decided I had to write it in first person. And then what that ended up doing, because I also, kind of chose a memoir style, it made the structure of the book incredibly difficult. And I hadn't really thought of that before I started trying to write it and kind of plan it out. It's like one of those things of, oh, this is so much fun. I have her voice. I get her voice. This will be so easy. Oh, not so much. Because I was telling the story in a chronological way, but I couldn't tell the story of Katrina or the events of the novel in chronology, because she only knew what she knew and when others told her. So, for instance, she experiences the hurricane from afar, but we learn about Katrina through the stories that other people tell her in a non-sequential sort of way. So it was fun, but it was a headache.
And so I'm sure you did a lot of reading from people who experienced the storm from all those different perspectives, because you feel that as your, I'm someone who experienced the storm outside of New Orleans. So for us, it was a nasty hurricane, but we didn't have, the flood event from the levees. And so reading those experiences of people from all over, I could feel that in Knee Deep. It put me right back, and it's heartbreaking, and it's beautiful the way that you have it told. So I was wondering how many, are there any that stuck out for you, like memoirs, any of the historical research that you did?
Most of the research that I did was actually first person. I started the book 15 years ago, right after Katrina, and I went down to New Orleans shortly after, and I talked to people I knew who lived there, but also just people in cafes and bars. I always say, people in New Orleans will always eat, drink, and talk. You can get, it doesn't matter if they know you, as long as you're friendly and, not offensive, they'll just sit down and tell you their story. And so I took lots of notes on those stories. And I also, rather than reading other books, although I did do some research in that way, a few books that I really did enjoy, I went through social media and I looked at Facebook posts, and I I wanted to hear the firsthand stories when they were fresh. And I took copious notes and then did a lot of research about the hurricane itself so that I could have the time. I wanted the timeline, and I probably messed up something, and I'm sure somebody will tell me. But I really wanted the timeline right. I wanted when the levees broke. I wanted when the mayor issued the evacuation. I wanted all of those things to be accurate. But I then put the book away very shortly after, because I did not feel that I had the right to tell the first stories. I felt like the first story should be told by people who actually lived through it, who experienced it. And so I put it away until 10 years later, when I felt like enough books had been written and stories been told by the survivors that I could then revisit this book and Katrina become a metaphor for other disasters, not tell the story of Katrina, but use Katrina to tell the story, this love story, and use Katrina as the backdrop. But I had the huge advantage of being able to go back to my notes of the people I had interviewed when it was so fresh, when it was still visceral. They weren't looking at it through the lens of the past. I had that sort of present visceral experience to build the novel around.
Well, so Rebecca, you as well. So with the sinkhole and the Bayou Corn sinkhole that that opened, I hope opened is the right word.
The way to describe what actually, yeah, but they do. I believe opened is, yeah, a good description. Yeah.
Yeah. So your novel, while it's not, it's not set there in Bayou Corn, it is very much in ways inspired by that or modeled by that disaster. So was it so kind of Karol telling us that she wanted to tell a Katrina story and this love story and how they came together? Did you have a similar experience like that where the disaster meant something to your characters, or did you set out to write about a sinkhole and these are the characters that came to you?
Well, the characters were definitely there first. The landscape was there. Well, yeah, the landscape was there first, then Tara, then her mother, then their relationship. And again, Jeff, the wonderful workshop teacher, my writing mentor, I guess, in many ways. As I started to dial in Joan and Tara's relationship, he suggested that I bring in a more global story. And I'd had an inclination, for whatever reason, to somehow try to include a salt dome, because I've always found them, these mysterious geological phenomena, these, huge salt deposits that can be the size of a mountain that are buried, that are a huge part of Louisiana's geology. And so I just started reading about various salt domes, and then in reading about those, encountered accidents. There was the Lake Pinure industrial disaster that involved a salt dome. And then I came across the Bayou Corn disaster and the sinkhole that occurred there. And something about the fact that it was in this rather quite small community, and displaced the entire community, turned everyone's lives upside down. But in some ways, the story didn't go very far because it really impacted this very specific area. And it somehow it just appealed to me. I just had an instinct that it would work well. And then, of course, I didn't immediately make the connection, but Joan as an addict and the nature of addiction, and even the stereotype of the downward spiral of addiction, and but also the unstable ground of the family that has a parent that suffers with addiction, and the uncertainty, the child who can never fully relax. It just was a perfect metaphor for that. So it ended up working really well. And I also happened to have, there are many wonderful synchronicities and a lot of serendipity. I also have a wonderful friend who's a geologist, and he generously donated his time and his expertise. And, we would have long conversations, and I would say, Bill, can this happen in the backyard? Would they ever have any reason to have to, do this or that? Or how close could, I want my sinkhole to be this close to the house. Like, is that possible? What about the timeline? All of these things. And he helped me plot my story in accordance with the unfolding of the sinkhole event. So,
that is awesome. Like, what a fantastic kind of way to connect that. That's really great. Yeah. And like, what a great friend. So
yeah.
But yeah, so the disaster is just kind of I guess the two natural disasters are just one of the ways that your novels speak to each other. Another way that like really just tickled me as I was reading them was, so Karol, your novel is set in New Orleans. Rebecca, your novel is set in, small town, central Louisiana. And at one point, each of your characters have to go to the other place. So, and I just loved like seeing these characters that, are so comfortable in like the quarter at midnight, like all of a sudden they're in Cajun country and they're like, what is happening? Why is this? And it's, it's the same thing in Lifelike Creatures, like your, small town, community, several of them, or Tara and Joan, go into New Orleans, and New Orleans just overcomes Joan, right? Like the bulk of the city is so much for her. And I just kind of wanted to talk to each of you kind of about going into that other place and what it felt like to kind of destabilize your characters in that way. So Rebecca, if you want to kind of speak to that, and then Karol.
And I have to say, I mean, Tara, Karol, I just called you Tara. Karol and I have had many conversations about our books and the similarities and where they overlap, and we did not discuss this. So this is really
you're the first one.
Yeah.
You're the first one to point this out, and I was just like, oh my goodness, how could we not have seen that, Rebecca?
Oh, yeah. It's a really great insight about the fish out of water, which is always, it's just so fun. I mean, all you have to do is like drop the character in the environment and let them react, let one situation emerge after another and then just watch them react. And yeah, Tara is definitely, well, both Joan and Tara. I mean, Joan is, pulled into the sort of the shadow side, I guess you could say, of New Orleans. And Tara initially is, she enters the city in a state of high anxiety, I would say, because of her mother. And so she's sort of perceiving it through that lens. And it's at some points it does appear somewhat dangerous to her, but at other points she sees the playfulness and the magic and the musical side and the celebration and the festiveness, which for her is a revelation and does open up something in her to that experience.
Yeah, absolutely. Seeing what life can be. Yes. On another side of things.
Absolutely. And even going, there's a scene where she goes to the Tulane campus, and that is just a whole nother world. She's awestruck by the world of, the small slice of academia that she's exposed to. So, but then, and Karol, when Camille goes to see her cousins,
I know.
It's a wonderful foil as well.
Well, and I had really never thought about her being the fish out of water there until you mentioned it, Michelle. And then I was like, yes, of course she is. And I mean, Camille's mother, who is from Texas, who was a Texas transplant into New Orleans, had never left the parish until she left. I mean, she was like, she fell in love with New Orleans. She came for Jazz Fest. She never left. So she is not happy going to Cajun country and leaving her husband, Donald, at the bar. I mean, she would have preferred to put her daughter at risk and for all of them to have stayed at the bar. And Camille would have preferred the same. Mm. So they're evacuating under duress to a certain extent. And what happens to her, though, is that she experiences some racial attitudes of her cousins that she never knew existed before. She sees under the surface of a family that she thought was loving and accepting, and discovers there's fissures. I also found it, and this just sort of happened, but I thought it was kind of interesting that Camille's mom, who has let Camille wander around the quarter by herself since she was 10 years old, is very nervous about her going like down to the bayou in Cajun. I mean, it's like this complete reversal of what we don't know, right? Of what we don't know. And so that there is danger in that. Whereas, in Rebecca's book, it's going into, Joan goes into the shadows. Camille lives in the shadows. And it's like just fine, but it's going into the country that can be dangerous. So, yeah.
Yeah, that fear of the unknown, whatever it may be. And so since, Carol, you kind of brought up the idea of familial problems, I guess we'll say, I want to talk about found families. Found families are something that I love in literature. I think it's so beautiful, the ways that we can relate to each other. And so, Rebecca, you have this fantastic grandmotherly neighbor who, is like a bit of a weirdo and, the town taxidermist and that kind of thing, and like a super fun character. And then, Carol, you have a drag queen / bartender who like helps to raise Camille and is often the most caring presence in her life, because she's sort of ancillary to her parents' lives. But this character sees her for who she is and what she needs. So I was wondering if you guys could talk a little bit about that kind of found family aspect and what that meant to you in creating the ensemble of your characters.
Rebecca, you want to go? Or?
Sure. So you're referring to Miss Honore. And, the truth about her from a craft perspective is that Tara had to have somebody there who was somewhat stable. She had to have access to at least one trusted, stable adult. Otherwise, the relationship with her mother, it just wouldn't have worked. She wouldn't have had any way anything to grab hold onto at all. And as it was, she, barely did. So Miss Barbin and Miss Barbin is not like, Miss Honore is not super heavy-handed. But she does provide sort of an example and a bit of a moral compass. And she's very triggering for Joan as a result. Joan, as much of as in pursuit of pleasure and happiness and freedom, and she's not going to listen to anybody. I mean, that's her like overriding drive, but underneath it, she is aware of her failings as a mother. And Miss Honore, even for her to look at Miss Honore, a lot of times she projects this judgment onto Miss Honore about herself and her failings. So she feels a certain animosity toward Miss Honore because they remind her of what she's just not capable of in terms of her mothering and caring for Tara.
My husband and I have attempted in our life together to sort of create this extended family, which we have, which was really important for me coming from Texas and moving to Los Angeles to pursue screenwriting and being apart from my family for the first time. And I grew up in a very loving, big, extended family with aunts and uncles and cousins and all of that. And so I created something here. So I'm very much a believer in found families, of family that you count as friends and friends that you count as family. And I think for Camille, I was reminded of something that my Aunt Nancy told me, which was that children would find what they needed in other people. If they were missing a grandparent, they'd find one. And she herself, who had no grandparents growing up, found a grandparent. And because she got to choose, she found one with a horse. It's like, if I get to choose, let's get a horse in the thing, and became a real part of this older couple's life. And you're right, Michelle. For Camille, I mean, her parents love her, but they also have had this incredible relationship, romantic relationship, and have really only just needed each other. And so she has had to find other people. And Miss Anita Cocktail has become sort of, it's not like a mother or a father figure, but more like an auntie, And it's also very helpful because she has super math skills and Camille is lacking in that area. So she becomes her math tutor, but what she is a stable force in her life.
That's awesome. Yeah, she's a fantastic character. I enjoyed every scene that she shows up in, and there's a point, and you have to read both of these novels. That's what I'm saying. But there's a point in Knee Deep where Camille comes across Miss Anita Cocktail, and she's like, "Oh no, you're not Mardi Gras ready." And they literally swap outfits. It's like you have to be Mardi Gras ready. You're out in these streets, girl. Do it right. And I just was like, this is so New Orleans. This is everything that you see. And I loved it. I really enjoyed that character. So but yeah, I wanted to go ahead and give a minute to tell everybody that's watching us, if you have any questions, you can submit them through whatever medium you happen to be watching us through. They'll all come to me. So if you have any questions about the books or writing or anything you'd like to hear from these two fantastic authors, we would love to hear from you. So was there anything that you guys, that I didn't touch on, any themes that you guys wanted to talk about with your novels?
Well, I think Carol and I we talked before this, and we both were sort of feeling a little drawn to reading an excerpt. I don't know if we had the time for that, but Carol, does that still interest you? Am I okay?
Absolutely. Whatever we want to do.
Michelle, does that seem?
Yeah, that would be wonderful.
All right, wonderful. Well, Carol, would you like to?
Why don't you go ahead and start, and I'll pull mine up, okay?
Okay. So mine doesn't really need a setup because it's at the very beginning of the book, and it is in Tara's perspective. The secret of cigarette smoking revealed itself to Tara Saint-Romain a few weeks before she turned 14. She was crouched on the roof of the cavernous old house she shared with her mother, woozy and raw-throated from hacking her way through her first Winston Reds, swiped from the pocket of her mother's bathrobe. It had taken all her stubbornness and a flood of acrid tears to get it right. But now, as she gazed at the luminous drift of night sky with a chemical hum in her veins, she finally understood her mother's pack-a-day devotion. Her eyes landed on a single bright star, floating at the fringe of her tangle of dark curls. As she exhaled, sending smoke spiraling up and out, she imagined some trace of her left with her breath, even as her body stayed firmly rooted to this place and the heavy, familiar earth of Terrafine, Louisiana. Tara? Her mother's voice seeped into her awareness. Coming. She skimmed the night sky once more, then ducked through her bedroom window. Her mother was downstairs in the kitchen, her eyes locked on the TV, where a fleshy, tentacled mass quivered on the face of a doomed space traveler. You watching that again? Tara asked, stepping into the sweltering room. Must be the 100th time. The oven door hung open, belching heat across the worn linoleum. She switched off the knob and flung open the back door, then propped the box fan in the window above the sink. "Don't, Tara. I'll catch cold." Her mother clutched at her robe, drawing it closer. "If I'm going to make us something to eat, then the oven has to be off, unless you want me to die of heat exhaustion." "I don't want you to die." Her mother's roomy gaze found Tara. "Well, then?" Tara examined a can of red beans while resting her slender frame against the counter. "You don't realize it's broiling in here because you're stewing in it." Tara ladled beans and pork sausage over rice and carried 2 plates to the table. She studied her mother between bites, wondering if she was starting to resurface through the murk of whiskey and pills. Tara had become skilled at ferrying the two of them across these times, intuiting whatever was needed to keep the shadow of her mother from harm until they were safely on the other side. She made sure the bills got paid or put off and that they didn't starve. She chased away the Pentecostals and the insurance salesman, gassed up the lawnmower, and flipped the overpowered breaker switch. Invariably, her mother reemerged. It was just a matter of waiting it out. They ate in silence, with the night air winding through the kitchen until the alien beast was ejected from the ship. "Do you ever think about traveling to outer space?" Tara asked as the credits rolled. "And get my face sucked off? No, thank you. If there are aliens, you can bet they're just as twisted up as people. Better to stick to the demons you know." Her mother rattled the ice in her pink cup. "Can I get my bedtime drink? I'm ready to go upstairs." Tara splashed Jim Beam into the cup and topped it with root beer. "Thank you, baby." Her mother wrapped her in a flimsy hug, and Tara tried not to recoil at her sharp, unwashed smell. She watched her mother climb the stairs, pale fingers gripping the railing, her lank hair a spill of muddy gold down her back. "The window," her mother called from the top step. "I know, Mama. I'll shut it."
I love that. I love the way it starts with the cigarette smoking. I mean, I haven't smoked in so many years, but I still like to think about it. And it's described so beautifully. I was like hooked from that very beginning. So, since you read the beginning, I'll
Yeah.
read my beginning. So that way there's no setup, right? We'll
Great.
just jump right in. You know how people are always saying what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas? Well, what happens in New Orleans mainly gets ignored. The truly bizarre may end up as the punchline in a joke, but nobody gets their panties in a twist over comings and goings that ain't any of their business. Let me explain what I mean. I once saw a little man, no more than 3 feet tall, dressed in a tuxedo, chasing after a naked lady down Bourbon Street, and nobody around me even blinked an eye. I did not have a regular childhood. I spent my formative years doing my homework bellied up to my daddy's bar, a seedy-looking establishment in the shadow of Bourbon Street. And even though bartending is a highly respectable occupation in New Orleans, I hated telling my friends what he did for a living, not because I was ashamed, but because the question was always followed by asking where he worked. You see, my issue wasn't with his running a bar. It was the name of the bar itself that was the problem. The Coxcomb. Try explaining to teenage boys with nothing but sex and dirt on their mind that coxcomb refers to the fleshy red skin on top of a rooster's head. It does not work. I was the butt of many jokes, and did I mention that I hate being teased? 2 summers ago, when I left an all-girls middle school for a co-ed Catholic high school, St. Bede the Venerable in the 9th Ward, I begged Daddy to change the bar's name to something less objectionable, like Camille's, my given name, Bar and Grill. Now, sweetie, you know I would do anything for you, he told me. But the coxcomb has been in our family since my daddy's daddy won it in a poker game from a gambler off the riverboat. These walls breathe history. Jean Lafitte sold his stolen goods in the back room, and Lee Harvey Oswald sat in that corner booth all by himself and ordered up a White Russian. The name of this bar and all it implies gives meaning to our lives. Sweetie, we are nothing without a sense of place. He was right about that. Where we live defines who we are. I spent so much time living in that bar, watching the clientele change as the sun moved across the sky. The afternoons were reserved for media types, journalists, and a few fiction writers who were replaced in early evening by what my mother called the ne'er-do-wells, and what my daddy argued were the true citizens of Orleans. And late nights, the tattooed and pierced stumbled in. I grew up telling time by who pushed open the massive oak door and walked inside. But none of us, not my parents, not my cross-dressing tutor, nor either of my best friends, could have predicted the evil that would push through the doors of our lives following the tragedy of summer. Our story is a tale of survival, of those who lived and those who died. And although it is our story, I will begin with me because I am the one telling it.
I mean, who's not going to keep reading that?
I was going to say, like, on that perfect note,
Yeah.
I will remind you guys. So the books, let me get in frame. There we go. So Knee Deep and Lifelike Creatures are available in the shop. They're available on our website. You can give us a call. Support these great authors. This is Rebecca's debut. Show her that, like, she's awesome and we want to keep hearing more. So the books are available in our shop. The books are available on the shelves at the Livingston Parish Library. I want to say thank you so much to both of you for joining us tonight. Thank you to everyone for watching. You guys have all been wonderful.
Thank you for having us, Michelle.
Oh, thank you so much. And I have to say, I love the way that my bookcase looks like it's in your store.
It's
That did just kind of work out, yeah.
I suddenly feel like I keep wanting to see what's there, you know. It's like, so anyway, do support your local bookstores. We're all about that. We so appreciate you supporting us too.
Well, thanks, you guys. And John will be back next week with another live. So we will see you then. Bye.
Bye.